So I'm Marion Huggins. I'm from the New Haven Free Public Library. I'm here with my colleague, Seth Godfrey. And we are so happy to have back Professor Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne grew up in St. Louis. He did his undergraduate work at Princeton. He earned a law degree from UC Berkeley, and he received his Ph.D. from Columbia. He hosts the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African Studies at the University of Houston. And he's authored, I want to say, 32 books. And this is one of his latest, The Bittersweet Science, Racism, Racketeering, and the Political Economy of Boxing. We'll talk about this book this evening as part of our Book Sandwiched In program. Most of you know that Book Sandwiched In is usually lunchtime, but I think it's a good advantage to have it this evening. So instead of Book Sandwiched In, it could be like Books Dinner In. So Dr. Horne, welcome again. We're always glad to see you. We've been watching you on various outlets on Letters and Prose, and then we looked at you today. Seth, you remember what the name of that one was?
It was with Dr. Sharice Burden. That was a great interview with her.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So we've been following you.
Oh, good. Glad to hear it.
In a good way.
In a good way, right?
Good.
Yeah, in a good way.
Well,
Go ahead.
Well, thank you for inviting me back. I appreciate it. It's always a pleasure. I've spent a fair amount of time in New Haven in past decades, and it's one of my favorite places to visit and do research. So certainly I'm appreciative of this invitation. And so I'm going to talk about this book on boxing. And the book has as a subtitle, as has been announced, Racism, Racketeering, and Political Economy. And I focus heavily upon Black American boxers, at least in the earlier chapters. And one of the reasons is that I try to associate certain disproportionate percentages of excellent Black American boxers, connect that to material conditions. That is to say that if you look at the African slave trade, for example, you may know that on the eastern coast of Africa, you had certain martial arts developing, whereby Africans who were trying to fight off potential enslavers developed various forms of fighting and martial arts. And if you look at the west coast of Africa, particularly Angola, particularly the slave route that leads from Angola to Brazil, you see the development of different kinds of martial arts. So that is to say, capoeira, for example, which is a combination of a kind of ballet and martial arts. If you're not familiar with it, you may want to look at some of it online. But it's North America that I heavily concentrate on. And that brings us to what's known as the battle royale, which is a phrase that before I began to research this book, I oftentimes use without being aware of its connection to slavery. During the so-called battle royale that takes place during the heyday of US slavery in particular, you would have 9 or so young Black men blindfolded and put in a ring, and they would have to go at each other for the entertainment of the slave master and the slave master's comrades. And whichever slave emerged triumphant by somehow managing to triumph over 8 or 9 other men would then receive some sort of prize. And this was the kind of material condition that helps to explain how and why it is that from certainly the 19th century going forward, up until relatively recent times, you've had a certain amount of, quote, success, unquote, of Black American fighters. For example, Bo Jack, B-E-A-U Jack, who was a lightweight champion in the United States, if not worldwide, in the 1940s, before being forced into retirement in the 1950s. He got his start with the Battle Royale, which of course leads you to the obvious conclusion that it continued in the post-slavery era to a certain degree. And that foundation, of course, helps to explain the rise of some of the first most popular Black American boxers. Speaking of Jack Johnson, who some of you may know because the great actor James Earl Jones played him in the movie and stage play, The Great White Hope. Jack Johnson was born in Galveston, Texas, one of the major depots for the unlimited African slave trade. He was catapulted into prominence at the turn of the 20th century. And despite the fact that many Euro-American boxers would not box or would not fight Black boxers because they thought it was beneath them, somehow he was able to wangle a championship match and was crowned the heavyweight boxing champion of the world, which caused quite a stir and quite a controversy because it was thought that the heavyweight boxing champion of the world was somehow the emperor of masculinity, if you like. And the idea was that Black Americans were not actually, quote, real men, unquote, because, quote, real men, unquote, do not, quote, allow themselves, unquote, unquote, to be enslaved or to be subjected to Jim Crow. They were thought to be yellow-bellied cowards, to use that phrase from the past. And so when Jack Johnson becomes the emperor of masculinity, all hell breaks loose. That is to say that films are made of this bout that he wins in Reno, Nevada. And what's interesting, as you may recall, is that film as a medium basically has a start, say in the late 1890s. And this was one of the most popular early films, this film of Jack Johnson triumphing. But ultimately what happens is that the film was seen as so toxic by some and so explosive by others that for the longest it was confiscated and not allowed to be shown. As well, when the film was shown, and of course Black patrons would cheer on Jack Johnson, this oftentimes led to attacks on the Black community, on those who were cheering Jack Johnson in this film match. And so ultimately what happens is that Jack Johnson finds it necessary to flee the United States. Actually, I talk about this in an earlier book I wrote called Black and Brown, African Americans in the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920, because what happens is that Jack Johnson flees to Mexico during the Revolutionary decade, the aforementioned 1910 to 1920, and he allies with Mexican revolutionaries. But it's not only Mexico that he flees to Europe. He spends exile time in Europe, and Barcelona, he says, is his favorite city. He is in pre-revolutionary Russia as well. But it's in Mexico that he meets his Waterloo, because what happens is that he's trying to establish alongst the border these anti-Jim Crow citadels. And he was doing that in league with Mexican revolutionaries. But alas, you have regime change in Mexico. And so Jack Johnson has to come back to the United States, where he serves a term in prison. And by that time, his boxing career is going into eclipse, because as you probably know, with regard to most professional athletes, their careers are rather limited. It's very unusual to have a George Foreman, who you may be familiar with, the boxing champion who fought Muhammad Ali in the 1970s, and up until about a few years ago, maybe a decade or so, he was still in the ring. But that's very unusual, highly unusual. Another boxing champion of this era, of the era following Jack Johnson, that is Joe Louis, who some of you may be familiar with. He's the boxing heavyweight champion in the 1930s through the 1940s. He's very close to the organized left. I mean, that's one of the interesting aspects about some of these celebrated boxers. Just like Jack Johnson allied with Mexican revolutionaries, you had Joe Louis, who was called the Brown Bomber. He was famous worldwide, not least because of his defeat of Max Schmeling, the boxer from Nazi Germany, who he had a number of titanic matches with. And it was thought that when Joe Louis defeated Max Schmeling, that augured a defeat over fascism, just as when Max Schmeling once defeated Joe Louis, it left many people terribly depressed, thinking that fascism could not be overcome. But Joe Louis also allied with the Progressive Party of Henry A. Wallace. Recall that it was in 1948, backed by the organized left, that the former Franklin Delano Roosevelt vice president, Henry A. Wallace, ran a serious third-party candidacy for president of the United States, although he did not do as well as many thought he would. The fact is that he ran an anti-Jim Crow campaign, which was very unusual in 1948, and that helped to push the eventual victor. Speaking of Harry S. Truman, who of course had replaced Wallace in 1944 as the FDR vice president, and then succeeded to the presidency in 1945 when FDR passed away. It helped to push Harry S. Truman to the left, giving him an undeserved reputation for being some sort of avatar of Black freedom, since he felt compelled at that time to take moves, for example, to desegregate the armed forces. Recall that the United States fought the battle against fascism during World War II, 1941 to 1945, with a Jim Crow army. So Joe Louis, I think it's fair to say that his political connections got him into hot water. The Internal Revenue Service came after him. He also got into hot water when, like many athletes, he thought it would be useful not just to be a paid performer, but to be an entrepreneur. And so in league with the Black entrepreneur Truman Gibson, they tried to take over the sport of boxing. And this is where organized crime comes into play. Of course, they were prevalent all along, but with the invention of television, which becomes a mass commodity in the United States by the 1950s, and the networks are looking for programming. And so they have boxing matches on television on a regular basis. And then there are commercials for razor blades and beer and all the rest, which brings in a cascade of revenue. Joe Louis and Truman Gibson decide they want a piece of the action, but they learn a very important lesson that I'm not sure that certain Black entrepreneurs have learned even today, which is that if you're going to try to climb that greasy pole of financial and economic success and challenge the 1% or the 0.001%, you would be well advised to have influence in the district attorney's office, in the US attorney's office, because what happens, of course, is that Truman Gibson, a Harvard-trained lawyer, is indicted and barely escapes prison. This is in the 1950s, because he is allied with a certain faction of organized crime, but another faction of organized crime has, as they say, juice with the prosecutors. And so he barely escapes prison. Joe Louis, of course, does not do very well himself because the IRS takes a good deal of his income and wealth. He winds up, as you may know, as a welcomer at Las Vegas casinos, just as you have people, I understand, who welcome customers who come into Walmart. Well, he would welcome customers who would come into Las Vegas casinos. It was a rather ignominious climb down for a man once wealthy and notorious. And then, of course, in terms of the triumvirate of Black heavyweight boxers, we must, of course, reflect on Muhammad Ali, the erstwhile Louisville Lip, who wins a medal at the Olympics Rome in 1960. And then, as you may have noticed from documentaries and films and books and all the rest, he joins the Nation of Islam, changes his name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali. My thesis in the book is that one of the reasons that leads into the nation, one of the reasons, certainly not the sole reason, is that these Black boxers were very vulnerable to being exploited, or perhaps even mangled or assaulted or killed by organized crime figures who basically controlled the sport to the point where the saying went that the sport was so corrupt and scandal-ridden that if there were more headroom, they probably should have boxing matches in sewers. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is that with Muhammad Ali becoming part of the Nation of Islam, he has a kind of militant backup insofar as the Nation of Islam has this formation called the Fruit of Islam, which of course was a sort of provided a kind of protective cordon for Muhammad Ali. In any case, he rises to the highest level of the sport, becoming heavyweight champion, but refuses to go fight in Vietnam on religious principles. And that turns him into a kind of mass hero. So once again, consider Jack Johnson aligning with Mexican revolutionaries, trying to establish anti-Jim Crow citadels along the border with Texas. Joe Louis aligning with the Progressive Party and Henry A. Wallace in 1948. And then Muhammad Ali becoming a symbol of anti-war activism. And of course, when the authorities prevent him from boxing, he begins to tour college campuses to make a living and becomes even more popular because many college students, particularly male students at that time, are worried about being conscripted, and they identify with Muhammad Ali. I should also mention some of the less glorious aspects of Muhammad Ali's career. For example, in 1980, he is convinced by then US President, 1979, he's convinced by then US President Jimmy Carter to tour Africa on behalf of the United States and then convince African nations not to go to the Moscow Olympics, and many African nations did not necessarily accept that kind of lobbying by Muhammad Ali, and it did not win him many fans in Africa, I'm afraid to say. But I don't think that should detract from his anti-war activism and his symbol as a figure of resistance. I should also mention some of the promoters, the men, mostly men, who are making the money from the exploitation of these boxers. For example, still in the land of the living, although both are approaching their centenary, 100 years old, are Bob Arum of Las Vegas and Don King, man who with the electrified hair, of Cleveland via New York, both of whom were rather shameless in their exploitation of these boxers. And I should also mention as well that in this book, I talk about a number of non-Black boxers, and talking about them raises interesting sociological questions. For example, before 1945, you have a spate of well-known Jewish American boxers, and they are, of course, embraced by the Jewish American community. And what's striking is that that phenomenon of the battling Jewish American boxer begins to dissipate post-1945 in the United States of America. And I think it has something to do with the fact that, as we know, post-1945, for various reasons, fascism is on the back foot because of the defeat of Hitler, along with its handmaiden, which is racism, and to a certain degree, anti-Semitism as well. And as a result, you see more opportunities opening up. For example, Truman Gibson, the aforementioned Truman Gibson, aspiring to be a promoter of boxing and not just a Black American in the ring. And then you see more opportunities opening up for Jewish Americans as well, not only because of the changing political climate, but also because of social welfare programs such as the GI Bill, which provides veterans benefits to those who had fought during World War II. Likewise, in recent decades, you've seen the rise of Filipino boxers such as Manny Pacquiao, who I understand is running for higher office in his homeland. And of course, a celebrated number of boxers of Mexican and Puerto Rican descent as well. And likewise, it's useful to note that boxing has attracted a number of political personalities, probably because the kind of battling that one does in the ring may be useful in terms of battling in the halls of Congress. For example, the late Harry Reid, the former Senate leader from Nevada, was a boxer. Barry Gordy, who, as far as I know, is still in the land of the living and is still celebrated for Motown Records and catapulting Diana Ross and many other stars, Michael Jackson, et cetera, to celebrity, was a boxer. Nelson Mandela, the first president of Democratic South Africa in 1994, was a boxer. And then, of course, you have perhaps as the ultimate expression of the exploitation and the scandalous nature of this sport is the fact that a noted boxing promoter was Agent Orange himself, speaking of Donald J. Trump with regard to his ill-fated casinos in Atlantic City. And this, of course, raises another question. Historically, there has been a debate as to whether or not boxing should be outlawed or somehow better regulated or somehow reformed. And it's a debate that will not go away, particularly as long as you have these rather ethically challenged figures like Donald J. Trump, who are profiting handsomely from the shameful exploitation of these men, mostly men, who are being exploited. Although, of course, I do in the book deal with the recent phenomenon, which is the rise of women boxers, including a daughter of Muhammad Ali. But I don't think that this idea of either outlawing this sport, which is based upon, some might say, inflicting brain damage, or a sport that is thoroughly riddled with organized crime figures, which makes it a kind of metaphor for capitalism itself. And speaking of a metaphor for capitalism itself, let me mention two other points. One is that, as noted a moment or two ago, boxers are considered to be figures of masculinity. And there hangs a tale, because you could also say that they're figures of toxic masculinity, which brings us to one of the most unfortunate episodes in the history of this inglorious sport, speaking of when Emil Griffith, with roots in the Caribbean, executes in the ring Benny Paret, who has roots in Cuba. This happens at Madison Square Garden in New York, after the soon-to-be deceased Cuban fighter uses a homophobic epithet to describe his opponent, speaking of Emil Griffith. And Emil Griffith, who happened to have been gay, did not appreciate this. And so he executes him systematically in the ring, as a bloodthirsty crowd is cheering him on. In some ways, that's sort of the ultimate episode, the ultimate chapter in the history of boxing. Profit mongering at Madison Square Garden, homophobia, toxic masculinity, all wrapped up in one neat package. But let me end on a more hopeful note, which is that boxing has also been a major sport on the island of Cuba. And of course, boxers there, oftentimes they have a headgear, as one has in the Olympics, which presumably should curb the rise of brain damage, amongst other issues. And you may recall that during the heyday of Muhammad Ali, there was a lot of discussion about him battling the Cuban great Olympic champion, Teofilio Stevenson. That never happened. But let us say that perhaps the Cubans, as in other fields, have a thing or two to teach us about this sport, the sport known to some as the sweet science, which I refer to as the bittersweet science, insofar as dialectically, it can involve, like capoeira, a kind of ballet and beauty, but at the same time, it's like the lotus growing in the mud. It's a beautiful sport that's thoroughly embedded in the muck and the grime of capitalism. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. I'm glad that you mentioned how it was called the sweet science, because I couldn't figure out that it was sweet. I couldn't figure out how it was sweet. I did want to talk to you about Jack London. I can't look at a book cover of Call of the Wild or any of that without thinking of his famous phrase, the Great White Hope. Can you just talk about that for a couple of minutes?
Yeah, Jack London, I recall growing up reading many of his novels. Jack London is an interesting figure too, because he considers himself to be a socialist. In fact, the late great historian Philip S. Foner published an edition of some of Jack London's works because he considered himself to be a socialist. But obviously, he had, shall we say, ideological weaknesses because he was also a racist. And it sort of, it reminds me, I did this book on Southern Africa, White Supremacy Confronted. And maybe about a century ago, the left in South Africa, which was dominated by men of European descent, had this slogan, workers of the world unite for white South Africa. And I think if you understand that slogan, you begin to understand Jack London, for example, who on the one hand was a very talented writer, on the one hand lived a very adventurous life, was very prolific, even though his life was cut short, he did not get his, what is it, 80 years on planet Earth, but was also a white supremacist and racial chauvinist, which is even more remarkable since his roots, or at least the city that claims him, is Oakland, California. You're probably familiar with Jack London Square in Oakland. And during his heyday, Oakland did not necessarily have the kind of Black population that it has today, to put it mildly. So it's a very curious amalgam, speaking of Jack London, how on the one hand, he could, some of you are probably familiar with his novel. I think it's called Iron Heel. Is that the name of the novel? It was turned into, it's a very class conscious novel, but strong ideological weaknesses, to put it mildly.
Dr. Horne, I want to, it's interesting, as an American secular Jew, I remember growing up, and, it was a slightly tough neighborhood. My uncle used to say, you got to be like Benny Leonard. You brought him up in the book. It's fascinating.
Right.
My uncle was born in 1990, so we revered him. And you bring up others like Harry Haft, who fought in the concentration camp. Unbelievable how he survived. And I was fortunate in the Soviet Union. I met Igor Vygotsky, who I think fought Teofilo Stevenson. So again, it's like, you talk about boxing under socialism, and meeting the Soviet Jewish boxer. I'm thinking it's kind of interesting, as he talked about how it differentiated from boxing here. He called it barbaric in the U.S. He said under socialism, we have protections, and so it got me thinking. I was always averse to boxing. I mean, two guys beating the shit out, she was the worst, basically beating the shit out of each other, pounding each other, and so it's. I think Danny Rosenberg did an article on you in the People's World, reviewed your book. He does bring up that aspect. He was, there's some great boxers out of Hungary, Soviet, all the socialist countries really put forth some incredible boxers in the Olympics. So it was always funny. I was just, I try, when I was a kid, to protect myself, Taekwondo, and I got knocked out. My mother said, "You'll never be a veterinarian." Well, here I'm a librarian, so this is my fate. But that was great. I mean, I love that how you bring it in, and it's a fascinating period, the early part of the 20th century, with all these great Jewish boxers, and it's.
Well, let me also mention as well. You may want to draw certain inferences from the fact that some of our most stirring films, movies, have dealt with boxing. I'm thinking of Body and Soul with John Garfield. If you haven't seen these movies, you should write them down and watch them. They're very stirring, very, very remarkable. Or The Champion, I think that's with Kirk Douglas, if I'm not mistaken, the late.
And he got blacklisted, John Garfield, right? He was of course. Great actor, you're right.
And then, of course, Kirk Douglas, as a producer, helped to break the blacklist, so-called, when he hired Dalton Trumbo to do the screenplay of Spartacus, the great anti-slavery novel by the late Howard Fast. And then, of course, there's Requiem for a Heavyweight, which is another stirring movie. And so I think the aspect of boxing that the screenwriters and film creators are focused on is the elemental aspect of it. We're like a gladiator in ancient Rome, for example, where you're put into the ring and you're fighting for your life. And of course, under capitalism, fighting for your life is more than a metaphor. And so I think that that sheds light on why boxing has attracted so many creative artists, particularly filmmakers. And yeah, I don't consider myself, I should add, any sort of apologist for boxing. I'm as critical of the sport as any, although I must confess, growing up in St. Louis, I went into the ring, did not do very well. I think I escaped without brain damage, at least let's hope so. But St. Louis too brings me to one of the characters in my book, Sonny Liston, who you may recall was defeated by Cassius Clay, then Muhammad Ali, and was totally exploited by organized crime in St. Louis, one of the cities that he was associated with. As a matter of fact, he was associated with strike breaking as a kind of labor goon, which used to be a kind of profession for some who knew how to use their fists. And then, of course, wound up dying mysteriously in Las Vegas. There's some evidence to suggest that he may have upset certain organized crime figures in Las Vegas, and they may have done away with him. But it seems to me, if there are any screenwriters in the audience, that Muhammad Ali has gotten his due with regard to boxing. You recall that Will Smith played him on the silver screen. But I think with regard to tragedy and pathos, that Sonny Liston probably deserves a treatment by a talented screenwriter.
You know, I wanted to ask you, you know, the fight with, I think, bringing up Harry Haftigan and Rocky Marciano, again, organized crime, how predominant, I mean, people throwing fights, I mean, this is, it's unbelievable. Because you were working with the New York State Athletic Commissions. I mean, was this omnipresent? I mean, this fighters, boxers throwing fights and at the behest of organized crime, mafia, you know, this aspect of boxing. So it was.
Well, I would say that corruption in boxing was, if not pandemic, was endemic, to use the current words of the day. But I think what needs to be understood is that I think, it's particular with the rise of gambling nowadays, with regard to professional football. And you saw that this NFL player just got suspended a few weeks ago because supposedly he was betting on certain games. Supposedly he was betting on his team. But I dare say that sooner rather than later, despite or maybe even because of the tremendous sums involved in these sports, that there's going to be a scandal erupting with regard to throwing of games in the major US sports. Recall the 1919 Chicago White Sox, for example. They threw the World Series. That was also depicted on the silver screen. 8 Men Out. You may recall that.
Sales, yeah.
John Sayles movie, yeah. So, and for those who are interested, I looked at the files of the late senator, I think he's passed, Senator Fred Thompson of Tennessee. You may recall went on to become an actor as well as being a senator. And there's quite a bit in that file in terms of a Senate investigation of corruption in sports. But for various reasons, it has not been followed up on. I think for a number of reasons. One is that I think that this is part of the downside of the collapsing mainstream press. Because as you know, newspapers are shutting down all over the place in this country. And the New York Times can't investigate everything, I guess, or I'm not even sure if they would be inclined to do so. And so I think there's a scandal waiting to be uncovered that would soar far beyond boxing, that would encompass the entire area of sports. Because once you start talking about betting on activity, and for example, the Super Bowl, which we just had last month, which, as I understand it, is the event that involves more gambling than any other event. I mean, people are betting on everything. They're betting on who will win the pre-game coin flip. They're betting on whether the first play will be a pass or a run. I mean, they're betting on everything. This is taking place almost on every play. And once you have that kind of action, as they say in Las Vegas, it seems to me that it's almost inevitable that organized crime will put its finger on the scale. Now, speaking of organized crime, I should mention that that's become a particular interest of mine. I mean, I talk about it I did a book on jazz where organized crime plays a central role. I did a book on Hollywood where organized crime plays a central role. As a matter of fact, as I suggest in the book on Hollywood, one of the reasons why you have all this glorification of organized crime on the silver screen, we just had the 50th anniversary of the release of The Godfather, for example, which is the exemplar of what I'm discussing. I think that's because organized crime has played such a role in the history of that particular industry. As I've suggested, that's the reason. I mean, that's why they're glorified on the silver screen. And then, of course, I think that a connection can be drawn between organized crime in the 20th century and, for example, slave traders in the 18th, 19th century, pre-1865, which today we might call human trafficking, which, as you know, is another lucrative branch of organized crime. And I did an article. I noticed that you're putting stuff in the chat. You may want to put in the chat this. I did this article some years ago called "Rethinking the Lumpen," Lumpen, where I try to theorize just like you have petty capitalists, like a person who has a mom and pop store on the corner in New Haven. And then you have big capitalists, like the ones who live on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And so I think that with regard to these lumpen characters, you have big lumpen and you have middle lumpen, you have small lumpen. And I think that it's an essential part of US culture and the US political economy. And oh, there it is. Yep, that's it.
We got a great team.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about this more. Oh, actually, this brings me back to New Haven because I'm now doing research on the Black Panther Party, which, as you know, stirred controversy in New Haven in 1969 when they had the trial of Chairman Bobby Seale. And of course, part of their whole platform was a kind of glorification of the lumpen, which I think is one of the factors that contributed to its unfortunate downfall.
I was just taking a note about the lumpen. So the last book that we talked about with you was the book on 15th century settler colonialism. And I was very surprised that for this book, you came way ahead, historical wise. And then I just heard you say you did one on jazz as well. So was jazz and boxing your personal interests? Were there subjects that you were particularly interested in that you wanted to research?
Oh, sure. I mean, first of all, my younger brother's a jazz musician, and I grew up listening to this music. St. Louis is a hotbed for music. Miles Davis is across the river, Alton, East St. Louis, Clark Terry. Growing up on my block, for those of you who may be jazz fans, in St. Louis, was the Bowie family. Lester Bowie, who was a late trumpeter. He helped to found the Art Ensemble of Chicago, which is the celebrated avant-garde ensemble. And so to me, like writing about jazz, it was a way, I felt I knew a lot about it to begin with. So I was sort of ahead of the game because I'd been listening to it most of my life. I knew most of the figures. It was just a matter of finding out, of developing a storyline, a narrative line, and then finding out where the archives are, and then developing themes. And so likewise, with regard to boxing, I mean, I followed boxing for the longest. I mean, I've been doing this, the first thing I do in the morning is read the sports page.
Oh.
And I thought I was going to do a book on baseball, but I couldn't come up with what I considered to be a thesis, that could drive a book. And so I set that aside for boxing. Although I haven't given up that idea, it's just a matter of coming up with a thesis, because, and I should also say, with regard to the book on Hollywood too, I've been watching movies forever. And so I already knew a lot of that history just from being a cinema buff. I mean, I still watch 2 or 3 movies a week, although mostly they're documentaries nowadays, because I use it to supplement gaps in my knowledge. But and then I was living in Southern California as well, and it just seemed like a logical project to pursue. I just saw a question in the chat too. Could you read it to me?
It says, is your research approach to the books about boxing and jazz and Hollywood the same as your research for more historical topics, like the dawning of the apocalypse?
Oh, I see. Well, there are probably some parallels. I mean, with any of these research projects, you have to find archives, basically. And you have to develop a thesis, for example. I'm doing research now, and so I have this book on Texas coming out.
Oh wow!
In a few months, and so I'm still in sort of semi-lockdown. I'm watching the news very carefully about BA2, so I haven't broken out of lockdown altogether. So I'm developing these new projects. And so one of the reasons I mentioned this Black Panther project, that's one of the projects I'm working on, because I sort of have a roadmap. I know where the archives are. I know the chronology. I have a thesis. So it'll be a rather simple book to do. Then I have these other projects where I'm sort of floundering, because I have a project on Northeast Africa, for example, the US and Egypt and Ethiopia. Because after the US Civil War, you have all these Confederates who moved to Egypt. There's this centuries-long millennial conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia. It's still in existence, as a matter of fact. And so they're going to help the Egyptians subdue and subjugate the Ethiopians. So that's one of my projects. I mean, that's one of the storylines, but it's going to involve travel, and who knows when I'll be able to go to that part of the world. I have another project which is like the Black Panther project. It's doable. It's on slavery in Washington, D.C. Because it's a finite time period, because Washington, D.C. comes into existence shortly after the founding of the United States. That slavery ends in the 1860s. So those are the bookends. And then what's interesting about it is that the slave owners are paid reparations in Washington, D.C. once slavery is abolished. So people who talk about reparations need to consider that. You've had reparations, but for the slave owners. Of course, in the rest of the South, they were expropriated without compensation, which is one of the reasons they and many of their descendants are so angry to this very day, because their property, billions of dollars in property, was confiscated without compensation. One of the largest expropriations of private property before 1917, for example. And also a significant percentage, Washington Post just did this whole series on a heavy percentage of the legislators in Washington were all slave owners. As a matter of fact, you had a woman, I think it's the first woman to serve in the US Senate. I think her name was Rebecca Felton. You can probably look that up. They uncovered she was from a slave owning family and she served in the 20th century, for example. So that's a doable project, but as I said, this Black Panther project is sort of taken over my life because, in part because I lived through it and I know some of the characters and I was shaped by that influence. And then some of the stories are so heartrending of what happens to, yeah, there she is, Rebecca Latimer Felton. Yeah. It's so heartrending.
What's your angle on when you're doing your research on the Black Panther? What in terms of your book? A lot's been written. So what?
Well, I'm dealing with Los Angeles, for example.
Yeah.
You know, I have a lot of connections to Southern California. It's Southern California. So one is that, first of all, as a historian, I don't have a take on this yet, but I'm going to have to figure out why were the Black Panthers so heavily centered in California, for example. I mean, they supposedly started in Oakland, although the roughest, toughest chapter was in Los Angeles. I mean, the key figures associated with the Panthers are out of Los Angeles, be it Eldridge Cleaver, Elaine Brown, George Jackson, Angela Davis was chairperson of the Bobby Seale Committee in Los Angeles. Johnny Spain, whose book I just read today, it left me emotionally exhausted. I mean, he was born in Mississippi to a quote white unquote mother, and apparently, he came out somewhat melanin deficient, but as he started to grow, you know, this hair started to assert itself. So it turns out that his father was actually Black. And so they dump him, they give him up, they send him to LA. And of course, he's all confused and he winds up being one of George Jackson's closest comrades. So I'm gonna have to deal, so LA is one of the issues. I mean, that's the locus of my study. And I'm have to deal with the lumping issue, as I said, and deal with student unrest. I mean, they have a lot of influence on campuses. The student unrest is just unbelievable in Southern California at that time. So those are some of the issues I'll be dealing with. Although I've only been working on this project for 3 weeks, so don't hold me to any of this.
You know, when I was in North Korea in 1989 for the Youth Festival, I was working with the North American department. I was a representative. So someone had met Eldridge Cleaver. The comment was, he goes, a very strange man, very demanding. Yeah.
Well, you know, it's interesting. You know, he winds up as this right-wing Republican, right?
Yeah, he went to the Moonies.
Right. And yeah, he's quite a character. Speaking of North Korea, he intended to dump his wife in North Korea and leave her there.
Catherine?
Go back to Algiers. Did you hear that story?
No.
Yeah, right.
I think she's in New Haven now. She teaches at Yale, I think. She did.
Oh,
Catherine?
she went to Yale Law School.
Yeah.
Kathleen Cleaver.
I didn't know that story. That's
yeah, it's quite a story, quite a story.
So Dr. Horne, when you're working on all these projects, are you finding like the information and keeping them in their separate files? Or are these, okay.
But computer, you know, this computer files, of course. There's some overlap, of course, at times. And I've rediscovered the virtues of microfilm. A medium that I once despised, but now there's so much on microfilm, it's unbelievable. I mean, people often talk about how much is on the internet? True, but there's a lot that's on microfilm that's not online. And if you look at my Texas book, when it comes out in a few months, you'll see that a lot, since I was in lockdown during the latter stages of the research, a lot of the sources and the material comes from microfilm.
So you, in writing the book, did you track when you were in New York in the archives? I mean, it's fascinating when you work with the New York Athletic Commission researching.
Yeah, so I was lucky. I went up to Albany
Mm-hmm.
to the State Archive,
Right.
and a very helpful archivist gave me electronic files with all their records, thousands and thousands of pages. And I came back and I printed them all out and then started going through them. And now I have an archival collection under my name at the Schomburg. So now all those records on paper are at the Schomburg Library for somebody who wants to follow up on a boxing project.
You know that Nicole Hannah-Jones mentions you in the introduction of the 1619 project.
Yeah, I know. Boy, I feel for that sister. I mean, I'm happy that she has a bestseller, which I'm sure will be lucrative, but she's taking a real beating. I mean, she even came up during the Brown-Jackson hearings with Senator Ted Cruz. I mean, whoo, boy, she's taking it. And don't go to Twitter and see what these people are saying about her on Twitter. Oh my God. As a matter of fact, there was an article on her in Vanity Fair where she admitted that she had started drinking because all the pressure and all the attacks, vicious attacks against this poor woman. So fortunately, I haven't faced that kind of scrutiny. Hopefully never will.
Well, Marion, we're getting to 8 o'clock. Did you want any final word or?
Actually, I think that we've had a very good session. We appreciate your time.
Very much. It's always
Yes,
a pleasure.
thank you so much. Thank you for coming on again with New Haven Free Public Library. Again, the book is The Bittersweet Science. It's available.
All branches, Marion.
All branches. We're always happy to talk to you. We're always happy to see you on YouTube when you talk to other people.
Do you ever sleep? I want to know if you sleep.
Yeah, I sleep like a baby.
Okay.
Because we feel like all you do is read and write.
Matter of fact, I believe I had a friend who was a public health professional. I was trying to convince her that we need to launch an entire campaign about the value and virtue of sleep. As a non-professional, it seems to me that it's of extraordinary value.
Okay.
Oops. Okay, so we're going to bid you good night. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
On behalf of the New Haven Free Public Library. Thank you, Seth. It was great being on with you.
You too. Everything. I hope to see you again, Dr. Horne, in your next book.
Same here.
Yes.
Good luck to you.
Yes. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Take good care. Stay
Bye.
well.